hours of June 5th, 1944, 6 Horsa gliders, towed by Halifax bombers, made their way across the Channel. Inside the lead glider, codenamed Chalk 91, sat 30 men readying themselves for one of the most daring missions of D-Day.
Insertion by glider was a truly horrific experience. The troops called it the silent coffin, as it was made of wood and canvas. It had no power of its own, and it was at the mercy of the elements. On top of that, they were also extremely challenging to fly. One false move by the pilots, and everyone on board could die. There were no second chances.
However, the mood on board was anything but grim. All the men, most of them Cockneys, Londoners from the East End, were singing songs at the top of their voices. Their leader, Major Howard, smiled. He was pleased they were going into battle with their tails up, he thought.
This was the very first action to take place on the whole of D-Day. The men of the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry were the tip of the spear. The stakes were huge. If these men didn't achieve their objective, Allied command was sure the Nazis would be able to push the British back to the sea and possibly stop the D-Day landings altogether.
At exactly 7 minutes past midnight on the 6th of June, the tow ropes were released. And with a sudden jolt, the gliders began to descend silently towards their targets. On board, the singing had stopped. The only noise was the whistling of wind over the glider wings and pilots giving instructions to their passengers. Little did the men realise that the next 24 hours would turn into a desperate battle for survival as they became surrounded deep behind enemy lines, attacked by tanks, snipers and the full might of the Nazi army. Sadly, some would never see home again. These soldiers wore the maroon berets of the airborne forces, known to the enemy as the Red Devils. To us, they are the Daredevils of D-Day. I'm Bruce Crompton, history lover, military antique collector and ex-paratrooper. In Amazing War Stories, you're going to hear about incredible actions, all taken from records housed in museum collections. It's only by unearthing these wonderful tales that I hope to support these important institutions, honour the heroes that sacrificed so much and help preserve their legacies for future generations. My personal museum is always undergoing transformation. When returning visitors come to see my collection, I try to give them a different experience. As some of our listeners will know, I recently bought one of the last surviving upkeep bombs for a display I'm putting together on the legendary Dambusters raid. You can follow its transformation on our social channels. However, another part of my museum is being transformed with a replica of a Horsa glider, complete with airborne troops disembarking from it. For those of you who don't know what a Horsa glider is, it was a large plane, nearly 70 feet long, that was designed to hold huge payloads. The gliders were towed into battle by heavy bombers, the only planes powerful enough at the time to do so. Military planners loved them as an alternative to parachuting troops in. However, the soldiers inside weren't as keen because travelling in them induced terrible motion sickness, as the tow ropes tightened and then went loose again during the flight. If you want to go and see some surviving examples of genuine Horsa gliders, then look no further than the Army Flying Museum in Hampshire. In my opinion, it's one of the best museums out there and is a must visit for anyone interested in military history. Henry Whitington is the archivist there, and he explained why gliders were used in this operation.
Just as modern airborne forces today are often delivered to the battlefield via helicopter rather than parachute, the same was true during World War II, when they were delivered by glider. There were several advantages to this. It meant that when they landed, a platoon-sized force was able to deploy straight away, silently, right on top of the target. This is as opposed to when airborne troops parachuted in, and they would often have to spend hours forming up because the wind had split them up over a large area. Not only that, it was also difficult to drop large weaponry or vehicles, so the paratroopers could only jump with what they could carry. A Horsa glider, on the other hand, could fit up to 30 men and a jeep or even a small anti-tank gun inside. There were some disadvantages of deploying by glider, however. Horsa gliders were very difficult to fly as they had no engines. They were towed to their target on long ropes pulled by powerful bombers who could then go on to fly and bomb another target. The ride would have been rough, and maintaining the glider's position behind the tow aircraft took great skill. Once the tow rope had been jettisoned, the glider had nowhere else to go but down, quickly. Landings would have been hard, on rough ground, and would have been very difficult to control. On top of that, German forces would often put hundreds of wooden poles in fields where they thought gliders might land, and hitting one of those was potentially fatal for everyone on board. So it was no surprise that the men who were flown in the gliders had a very ominous nickname for them: the Silent Coffin.
Still, despite the risks, this was the method of insertion decided upon for perhaps the most incredible operation undertaken on D-Day. It didn't have a specific name. Instead, it was known as the codenamed action of Operation Tonga. However, it has wrongly become known as Operation Dead Stick, which was the designation given to a glider training exercise in preparation for the assault. It's a mission that's close to my heart for several reasons. Firstly, it was a British airborne operation, and as most of you know, I'm an ex-para and still have my maroon beret. Secondly, I actually own one of the tow ropes used by one of the gliders from this very raid. Of course, that's going to take pride of place in my exhibition. However, perhaps my most prized item from this mission is an actual map of the target carried by one of the soldiers that took part. I now have it framed and you can see it on our artifacts page on the website amazingwarstories.com. But this mission wasn't a raid, it was a coup de main. The difference being a raid is an attack on a target that was then retreated from. A coup de main was a position that was attacked and then held. The target of this attack were two bridges that crossed the Caen Canal and the River Orne. During the preparations for D-Day, Allied planners had identified these two crossing points as high priority targets. The road that ran over them was potentially a major artery to the British landing beaches for the German panzer divisions based in Caen. Not only that, both the canal and river would be formidable obstacles for Allied forces to cross, should the bridges be blown by the Germans. Even if the British landings at Sword and Gold beaches in Normandy were entirely successful, without control of the crossings, the advancing forces would then become hemmed in, with no easy way over these two waterways. Command knew there was no nearby route around these two stretches of water, which ran closely parallel to each other and were over 9 miles long and over 30 feet deep. It was a perfect, if fortunate, defensive obstacle that Rommel had identified, and he structured his defences around it accordingly. So it was therefore vital that the two bridges were kept intact for the British forces to cross, but at the same time we also needed to ensure that the German tanks couldn't use them to sweep down to the landing zones. It was a difficult predicament to be in. We couldn't blow them, so we had to take them, hold them and pray the landing forces almost 5 miles away would quickly break through German defences to relieve them. Dr. Chris Mann, the head of the Department of War Studies at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, explained the complexity of the Allied landings at D-Day.
Operation Overlord, the code name for the invasion of Normandy, began on the 6th of June 1944. The actual landings, designated Operation Neptune, more commonly known as D-Day, were the most complex, logistically difficult and ambitious landings ever undertaken in the history of warfare. To this day, nothing of this scale has ever been attempted. The plan was for two groups to attack Normandy. The Americans would form the Western Task Force and would land on two beaches, codenamed Omaha and Utah by the planners. Their aim was to quickly take the town of Curator and then cut off the Cherbourg Peninsula. The Eastern Task Force would land on three beaches, with the British flanking the Canadians, who landed on a middle beach called Juno. The British beaches, Golden Sword, along with Juno, would shore up the eastern flank of Operation Neptune and protect against any attack from the main German forces based around Caen. The biggest threat on the day, the Allies presumed, would therefore come at Sword. It was the most easterly landing beach and exposed to Colonel Hans von Luck's 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, part of the 21st Panzer Division. If he and his troops were to get through, well, it could possibly mean the total failure of the Allied landings.
What makes this operation even more extraordinary is that it wasn't undertaken by what are now known as Special Forces. The men who were selected for this incredible mission were from a normal infantry unit, the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Regiment, known as the Ox and Bucks. Today they are now part of the Rifles, and they are a regular infantry division. The men were led by Major John Howard, an inspirational leader who was not only an ex-policeman but had also worked all his way through the non-commissioned ranks before becoming an officer. Chris Freddie Kruger is an ex-British para with ties to the airborne forces going back 30 years. He has been on tour in both Iraq and Afghanistan, where in 2006 his company were cut off behind enemy lines for almost 3 months during the siege of Musa Qala.
What makes this action so special for me is the men that fought in it. Today it seems people are only interested in special forces, so much so that the humble soldier who accounts for 99% of the army has rather become ignored in the public's eyes. The regular infantry soldier is often perceived as an unimportant cog in a huge machine, but the reality is actually far different. Even a lowly infantry soldier will be trained to the highest level and an incredibly wide variety of skill sets. As such, it should come as no surprise that there are instances where the lowly infantry soldier has outperformed special forces that were deployed in regular roles alongside them on the battlefield. The men who took part in this operation in 1944 from the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, which later through mergers and amalgamations became today's 2nd Battalion of Rifles. At the time they were not considered special forces, but a standard infantry unit composed, much like the rest of the army, of spirited young men.
Despite being self-assured, Howard knew this assault on the bridges was an incredibly risky venture, and he was sure there were plenty of people who thought the men of the Ox and Bucks were on a hiding to nothing. He was determined to prove them wrong. The assault troops did have a piece of luck in their favour, however. The bridge was defended by a garrison of 50 men from the 716th Infantry Division, a hodgepodge force that was made up from conscripts from occupied countries, not the fanatical Nazi-obsessed soldiers like other divisions. However, Command tried to fix this shortcoming by appointing an officer who was a dedicated Nazi, Major Hans Schmidt. But despite these credentials, he wasn't a model officer. Luckily for the Allies, by all accounts, he was a lazy and rather stupid man. As Major Howard thought of the task ahead, his hand went to his breast pocket where he kept a personal souvenir, his baby son's little red shoe. He was determined to see his children, Terry and Penny, again. Just then, the pilot shouted back, "Prepare for descent." Suddenly the mood changed and the high spirits of the past few minutes died out. Command had worked out the optimum height for the release of the gliders, 6,000 feet. This was to happen automatically just over the French coast and would give the pilots approximately 6 miles in order to orient themselves and land safely. Suddenly there was a jolt as the tow ropes were jettisoned and a lurching feeling of butterflies in their stomachs as the glider quickly started its descent. It almost felt to the men that they were dropping like a stone. There was, Major Howard thought, no turning back now. Remember, everything you are about to hear is true, no matter how extraordinary it sounds. Several months earlier, the sun was out at the Café Gondry. The building overlooked the bridge over the Caen Canal, which had been designed to swing up in order to let the traffic on the canal pass through unobtrusively. The owners of the cafe, Monsieur and Madame Gondry, weren't just affable waiters. They were actually part of the resistance. Both spoke more than one language. Georges had previously worked in a British bank in Paris, so his English was more than passable. Therese could also speak German, so between them they were able to overhear any useful information the loudmouth Schmidt used to boast about and then pass it on to the British. One such tidbit was the fact that the detonators for the explosives was kept in a bunker on the far side of the bridge. Schmidt had been ordered to blow it on the first sign of any landings. This information had been fed back via the resistance to MI6 and then to military planners who were preparing objectives for Overlord, the operation to take Normandy. Major Howard knew that he had to get to that bunker as soon as they had landed, otherwise his mission would be over before it had really begun. Brigadier Poet, Major Howard's direct report, had tasked him to seize the bridges intact and then hold them till relief came. The Major had been given anything he wanted to make sure he could complete the mission. At his disposal were his own company, D Company, plus 2 platoons from B Company. On top of that were 30 sappers who would be available to defuse any explosives. 1 wing from the Glider Pilot Regiment and 6 Horsa gliders. Poet explained that he didn't think the problem would be taking the bridges, it would be holding them. Allied planners thought Howard would face a fierce counterattack with enemy tanks spearheading the charge. With that in mind, Howard was to be reinforced by paratroopers of the 7th Battalion, 5th Parachute Brigade, 6th Airborne Division. This combined force would, if all went well, meet up with Howard and his men and help hold the bridges intact until the invasion force, spearheaded by the commandos, caught up with them, where they would then be relieved. It was a plan of many moving parts, each of which had to work perfectly if the plan was to succeed. As the gliders descended, they entered a wall of fog. The pilots literally couldn't see anything at all. The lead glider was piloted by Staff Sergeant Jim Walworth, and he and his co-pilot, Staff Sergeant John Ainsworth, were desperately trying to spot the Bois de Bavon, a large wood in Normandy. But they literally couldn't see anything beyond the windscreen, let alone the ground below. They needed a familiar landmark to orient themselves if they were to land in the correct spot. 1 minute behind was the glider, Chalk 92, piloted by Staff Sergeant Boland. And a minute behind them was Chalk 93, with Staff Sergeant Barquet at the control. Like the lead plane, the other 2 pilots also couldn't see through the fog. The mission had got off to a worrying start. The situation was no different for Chalk 94, 95 and 96, who were heading toward the river bridge, a quarter of a mile away. Meanwhile, down on the canal bridge, the sentries were changing the guard. Private Vern Bonk, a Pole, and Private Helmut Romer, a German, both looked up and heard the bombers fly over. But there was nothing unusual about this, for the Allies had been stepping up their raids over the past weeks. East of Caen, Oberst Hans von Luck, commander of the local German forces, also heard the planes. Looking up from the paperwork at his desk and out at the night sky, he too wasn't troubled. However, this seasoned soldier did notice that 6 planes seemed to be flying much lower than normal, probably dropping supplies to the resistance, he thought. Picking up his phone, he ordered a search of the area. Maybe he would get lucky and get some traitors, he thought. The one person who probably didn't notice anything was the bridge's garrison commander, Major Hans Schmidt. Reportedly, he was in the arms of a French girl in the town of Hronville, a few miles away, and so was otherwise occupied. Back in Chalk 91, Lieutenant Den Brotheridge went to open the door of the glider. Private Wally Parr gripped his webbing as he tried to force the door open, but it jammed. Brotheridge and Parr were 2 of Howard's hand-picked men. Parr had nearly been returned to unit during training for raiding the battalion's naffy and covering the parade ground with soapsuds, but the Major saved his skin and insisted a demotion was all that was needed. Brotheridge, due to be a father in less than a month's time, was the leader of No. 1 platoon, the first men to be across the bridge. The lieutenant was loved by the men and was a vital part of the force, Howard believed. The 2 soldiers struggled to get the door open and they were running out of time. It was imperative they did so because the impact could twist and break the wooden chassis, meaning none of them would be able to get out quickly. In the cockpit, the pilots were flying blind, relying on their compass heading, speed and a good old-fashioned stopwatch. "Now!" shouted Ainsworth, and Warwork turned the glider hard to starboard. The glider banked heavily in the fog, and the men inside strained against their harnesses. 30 seconds later came the same instruction and the plane made its final turn. Hopefully, they thought, when they emerged, it would be on target.
Flying in fog is one of the most dangerous things a pilot can do. Even experienced airmen today can become disoriented, despite all the modern technology on board. The trick to flying blind, as I believe it is known, is to trust your instruments. If you know your speed, your heading, and have a good navigator, you'll be fine. In the Second World War, the co-pilot of a glider would plot the progress of the flight on a map, knowing how far they had travelled by counting the seconds on a stopwatch. It sounds simple, but under pressure, at night, in unfamiliar territory, landing these aircraft in the right location in the midst of a battle and safely would take intense concentration and expertise.
The glider finally broke through the fog bank, and before them, the bridge gleamed in the moonlight. The pilots had no time to celebrate, however. They still had to get this thing down without killing everyone. The lieutenant had finally got the door open, and Parr stuck his head out. This was the first view the men had of France. They were already at tree high. The scenery was flashing by. Parr briefly saw the silhouette of the bridge ahead. Sitting back down, he braced for impact. Warwork set the glider down, but he didn't want to stop too soon. Howard's instructions had been clear. They were to try and crash the glider through the final barbed wire fence beside the bridge. The Major didn't want to spend valuable minutes trying to get through it with explosives, as well as losing the element of surprise. The airspeed on the dial was showing over 100 miles per hour, and the only way to slow them down to a more reasonable 50 to 60 miles per hour was the use of onboard air brakes built into the wings. But deploy them too early and they would be too far away from the bridge. The pilot gritted his teeth and large drops of sweat were streaming from his brow as he brought the plane down. The Horsa's 3 wheels touched the ground with a heavy bang and then immediately broke off, which they were designed to do. The glider bounced back into the air and then slammed into the ground again, this time sliding along its inbuilt skid.
Stream!
Shouted Walworth over the deafening noise, and Ainsworth hit the air brake deploy levers. Immediately the brakes on the wings opened up with an audible thump, and the plane lurched up onto its nose briefly as the speed dramatically came down. Off came the order, and once again the co-pilot pushed the levers again. The brakes once again off. The speed was coming down. 60 miles per hour, 50, 40. Then the glider smashed into the barbed wire, and in the process the nose of the plane was ripped off. Walworth and Ainsworth, still strapped to their seats, flew through the air, instantly knocked unconscious as they hit the ground. Inside the glider, the men had been thrown around like balls in a lottery machine. As the Horsa came to a stop, there was a deathly silence. Everyone on board had been knocked unconscious. Private Roma, the German guard on duty, had heard the crash and he ran to the edge of the bridge, peering out into the darkness. It looked like the mission was over before it had even begun. On board Chalk 91, the men were coming around. To the soldiers, it had seemed like they had been out for minutes, but in reality, it had only been about 10 seconds. Panic enveloped Major Howard as he realised he couldn't see. He opened his eyes and there was just darkness, nothing. I've been blinded, he thought. But then the friendly voice of Brotheridge was in his ear.
Are you okay, sir?
He whispered, adjusting Howard's helmet that had slipped down over his eyes in the impact. Suddenly the Major could see again and he felt a little foolish. He unbuckled himself from his broken harness and gathered his Sten gun. Brotheridge was already out the door, quietly encouraging the men to get out and start the attack.
Planning is everything when it comes to war. Sun Tzu, the famous militarist of ancient Japan, said every battle was won before it's fought. What he meant was preparation and planning was key to everything. The Major, having spent weeks practicing for this moment, knew if he was to stop the bridge from being blown, he had to land as close as possible. Luckily for him, he had one of the finest glider pilots in the entire Allied forces, Staff Sergeant Walworth. He had practiced this landing 42 times before today, and amazingly managed to achieve the impossible. The glider ended up smashing through the first defensive obstacle, the barbed wire fencing, and came to a rest right at the bottom of the embankment of the bridge.
The men raced up the embankment onto the bridge, their hobnail boots clanging on the metalled road. Lieutenant Brotheridge and Private Billy Gray were the first to see a German sentry standing in the middle of the bridge. Private Wally Parr and Corporal Bailey were a second behind, but instead ran over the road, their target the pillbox, which apparently held the detonation button for the bridge's explosives. Shouting, "Come out and fight!" Parr ran to one of its apertures and threw a grenade in. After it had gone off, he ran to the door, opened it and threw in a phosphorus grenade for good measure. Back on the bridge, Brotheridge was leading his men across. They needed to take the enemy emplacements on the other side. Facing him was the German Private Roma, who was completely shocked to see a group of raging paratroopers, their faces blackened, charging towards him. Turning on his heel, Roma ran, screaming,
Fallschirmjäger!
at the top of his voice.
Alarm! Alarm!
Suddenly the German guards woke up,
Schnell!
one firing a flare-up into the night sky. It was to be his last action as Gray cut him down with his Bren. As the assault began, the sappers had already started to check for explosives. It was imperative that the bridge wasn't blown, even if the pillbox was out of action. The Germans, now fully alerted, started to fight back, and Howard was terrified the bridge could be destroyed at any second. Meanwhile, along the length of the field, the other two gliders, Chalk 92 and Chalk 93, landed. The second glider found itself heading towards Chalk 91, which would be really bad news if it smashed into them. The pilots leaned on the controls and swerved their plane to one side, breaking the tail off in the process. When it came to a halt, Sergeant Bolland, the chief pilot, shouted back over his shoulder, "We're here! Piss off and do what you're paid to do." Chalk 93 also had a rough landing, the plane bouncing twice before dramatically coming to a halt just before a swampy piece of ground. Lieutenant Sandy Smith, an ex-rugby player, had been thrown out of the front window from the impact along with another man, Lance Corporal Greenhawk. As Smith came round and got back to his feet, Lance Corporal Madge came up to him and said, "Well, what are we waiting for, sir?" Unfortunately, Lance Corporal Greenhall had been knocked totally unconscious and had landed further up in the water with heavy kit on. In the darkness, no one saw him, and sadly, he drowned. He was the first Allied casualty of D-Day. As the rest of the men from Chalk 92 and 93 made their way to the bridge, Lieutenant Brotheridge was already 2/3 of the way down. He pulled out a grenade and threw it at the machine gun emplacement to his right. At that precise moment, a bullet sliced into his neck. Brotheridge crumpled to the ground, but Billy Gray, who was immediately behind him, didn't notice and carried on running towards the defending Germans. Reaching the end of the bridge, he watched the lieutenant's grenade go off and saw it had taken a number of men out. Snarling in anger, he finished the job with his brain.
Once a surprise attack is underway, the most important thing is momentum. In training, you'll constantly hear officers and NCOs encouraging their men to push on. Your natural instinct may be to take cover, stop and assess the situation, but that pause gives your enemy time to recover and make sense of the chaos and confusion around them. That pause gives them the opportunity to coordinate and hit back at you. Speed, aggression and momentum will 99% of the time carry the day in a surprise attack. The shot that hit Lieutenant Brotheridge was just an incredibly unlucky event, both for him and the rest of the men.
Less than a mile away, on the road approaching the bridge, a German soldier, Heinrich Heinz Hickman, was travelling in an open-top staff car with 3 other soldiers. A German parachutist and veteran of Sicily and Italy, he thought he heard gunfire. Ordering the driver to stop,
Halt!
he stood up, listening intently.
Hörst du das?
Within seconds, another burst rang out. There was no doubt about it. He recognised the distinctive chatter of a British Bren gun. Grabbing his Schmeiser, he told the men to ready for action, and the car gunned its way towards the bridge. The German staff car pulled up near the bridge and Sergeant Hickman got out, instructing 2 of his men to cross the road to the far side so they could take the flanks. At that moment, he saw Billy Gray firing his Bren. Standing up, he opened up with his Schmeiser, but missed. Gray spotted him and spun round, also shooting from the hip. Luckily for Hickman, he too missed. Realising that they were totally outnumbered and that the guards at the bridge were largely useless, the Major decided to get out of there and alert the staff at HQ as to what was going on. However, whilst the German bridge guards weren't seasoned combat veterans like Hickman, some of them did put up a fight. Lieutenant Sandy Smith had now reached the far end of the bridge. He had to limp there as the crash had badly twisted his knee. Just as he arrived, he spotted a German about to throw a stick grenade at Brotheridge's men. Opening up with his stem, he felled the German, who dropped his grenade. It went off with a terrific bang. Smith stood there shocked, and a corporal ran up and said, "Are you all right, sir?" Smith looked down and saw holes throughout his trousers and jacket, and then noticed his wrist. The skin had been blown away, exposing the bone underneath. Other than that, miraculously, he had escaped being seriously hurt by any other shrapnel.
Having been under fire myself in Afghanistan, I can assure you it's not like it is in the films. I know exactly what these guys would have been going through on them bridges. It may be a cliche, but when you are under fire, your training kicks in almost without you even realising it. You almost don't notice the bullets whizzing around because you've got so many tasks and responsibilities depending on your role or rank or the situation you're in. There have been instances of soldiers being shot or injured and not even realising it until it's been pointed out to them due to the intense focus of the job at hand and the rush of adrenaline.
By the time the attack had started, Private Bonk, the other guard on the bridge, had already retired for the night and was in one of the buildings down the road. Hearing the commotion outside, he went to investigate and was shocked at what he saw. Realising he would likely die if he got involved, he and another private grabbed their guns and ran off down the road, supposedly to try and find help. As they sneaked off in the darkness, Bonk fired his gun into the hedgerow. They had to make it look like they had at least put up a fight, he surmised. Meanwhile, at the other bridge, 2 out of the 3 gliders had landed successfully, but a third was totally missing. Chalk 95, containing Lieutenant Sweeney and 23 platoon, had landed behind Chalk 96, commanded by Lieutenant David Fox and 17 platoon. But there was no sign of Chalk 94 and Lieutenant Hooper. Regardless, these 2 landings, unlike those at the Beauville Bridge, were much smoother and largely without incident. Fox and his platoon gathered in the darkness after disembarking, and he quickly ordered his men forward. With the sergeant nowhere to be seen, Fox spoke to the corporal in charge, but he seemed to be ignoring him and wouldn't move. Asking him what was wrong, the soldier replied that there was an MG-32 gun emplacement spotted straight ahead.
"Oh, to hell with it,"
said Fox, and went forward, only to find himself face down in the mud as the German machine gun opened up. Sergeant Wagger Thornton, 17's platoon leader, had already spotted the threat, and putting the corporal in charge, had told his men to stay put whilst he went back to organise the mortar. "Bloody fool!" he snarled as he saw the gun fire on Fox, although it did give him an exact bearing to shoot at. The mortarman fired, and with a brilliantly placed shot, the German machine gun team were instantly neutralised. The introduction of the mortar to the battleground had a stunning effect on the rest of the defending Germans from the Eastern Bridge, who decided now was the right time to scarper. Back at Pegasus Bridge, as the Caen Canal Bridge is now known, Wally Parr and the rest of the men continued to clear out the defending trenches and bunkers at the western end of the crossing, grinding their way through them. But soon there were no more Germans left to kill. As they returned to the bridge, Wally asked, "Where's Danny?" The men shrugged. The private looked up and saw a figure lying 2/3 of the way down. Running over to him, he saw it was Brotheridge. Lifting his head, Parr tried to see how badly injured he was. The lieutenant tried to talk, but nothing came out. He too was to set another grim record, becoming the first Allied soldier to die from gunfire on D-Day. Meanwhile, Major Howard had set up a command post in a trench on the northeast end of the bridge. With his wireless operator by his side, he kept asking for news on how Chalk 94, 95 and 96 were getting on further down the road.
"What's the status at the other bridge?" Over.
The other bridge had been taken by Lieutenant Sweeney and Fox.
The other bridge has been taken, sir, but no sign of Hooper.
Hooper and his men had in fact got lost in the fog and had landed 8 miles away. There, after some skirmishes with some Germans which saw Hooper becoming captured and then incredibly becoming freed again, meant Howard was 30 men short. Nevertheless, he was jubilant. Both bridges were secure, and the first part of the operation, against all odds, had been a success. Ham and jam were the code words to use if the codenamed was successful, and by God was he going to use them. The Major turned to Corporal Tappendam, the wireless operator, and told him to keep broadcasting those 2 words till he had a reply from command. And the good news didn't stop there. The sappers had discovered to their amazement that the explosives hadn't actually been placed. Apparently Major Schmidt had defied Oberst von Luck's order to wire the bridge for demolition, thinking that if the Allies landed on the beaches 5 miles away, he would have ample time to set them. They had found the explosives in a small shed.
One of the important things to do on the battlefield is to keep your emotions in check. Jubilation or despair can cloud your vision and lead you to make poor decisions and errors of judgment. Major Howard would have felt elated at achieving his first objective, the capture of both bridges so quickly and with few casualties. However, the battle was far from over. Even if it all went according to plan, it could be hours before they were relieved. It was crucial that he remain focused on the task in hand.
Major Howard breathed a sigh of relief. Brigadier Poet, who should be on his way with the parachute relief force, had predicted that he would take the bridges with little difficulty. The real challenge, he said, would come in holding them. So far, Poet's prediction had come true. Howard prayed that the second part would not come to pass. Pushing any fears he had to the back of his mind, Howard knew he had to prepare for the Nazi counterattack. The expected onslaught would come soon, and they were told they would likely be facing overwhelming odds, including potentially one of the deadliest battlefield tanks the Germans had ever produced, the Tiger. I hope you've enjoyed the first part of this story, The Daredevils of D-Day. It's truly a cracker, but it's not over yet, not by a long shot. If you want to find out what happened to Major Howard, Wally Parr and the rest of the men, and which of them took perhaps one of the most famous shots of the entire Second World War, the shot that saved D-Day, make sure you tune into part 2, coming soon to wherever you get your podcasts. This episode of Amazing War Stories was researched, written and produced by Ed Sayer. The associate producer is Lois Crompton. Sound design and 3D mastering is by Vaudeville Sound, and the music is by Extreme Music.